Okay, well, welcome everybody. Our topic for today is two deeply human and often conflicting instincts, forgiveness and revenge. This topic feels especially relevant in today's political climate, where grudges and outrage and desires for revenge seem to dominate the conversation. We see cycles of blame and retaliation everywhere, not just between political parties and public figures, but even among friends and family. So I think that's why it's worth exploring how our instincts for revenge and forgiveness developed and how they operate. And perhaps if we can understand these emotions better, particularly what variables trigger forgiveness or revenge, we might find more productive ways to engage with each other. So let's dive in. Imagine you're living in a small, close-knit group of early humans thousands of years ago. One day, someone steals your food, harms someone you care about, or spreads a damaging rumor about you. How to respond? Seeking revenge might send a strong message to others in the group that you won't tolerate such treatment, and then that might deter any future harm. On the other hand, forgiveness could restore peace and cooperation, which are essential in a world where survival depends on working together. Remember, back then there were no formal laws, no police, no justice system. If someone wronged you, it was up to you to enforce fairness and deterrence. Retaliation signals strength and help deter further offenses. But revenge came with some serious risks. It could escalate conflict, it could fracture group cohesion, and it could spiral into ongoing cycles of hostility. That's where forgiveness enters the picture. The ability to forgive, when wisely applied, helps restore relationships, reduce conflict, and promote cooperation. And that kind of cooperation gave our ancestors a major survival advantage. In other words, our ancestors, as do we, had to make fairly complex social calculations. In this situation, with this person, am I better off forgiving or retaliating? Which carries more risk? Losing future benefits from this relationship or appearing weak and inviting further exploitation? We are all the descendants of those who got that decision right more often than not. People whose emotional instincts and social strategies enhanced their fitness. These ancient trade-offs still shape our behavior today. Our natural impulses towards revenge and forgiveness are hardwired, part of the emotional toolkit passed down from evolution. As the evolutionary biologist Robert Trivers put it, forgiveness is, quote, an adaptive response that helps us overcome the biological urge for revenge, thereby ensuring social cohesion and long-term cooperation. Oscar Wilde, perhaps with a bit more sarcasm, said, always forgive your enemies. Nothing annoys them so much. So, what does some of the research on forgiveness reveal? We're more likely to forgive when we sense the relationship is worth saving, when future cooperation is likely. That's why we often forgive friends and family more readily than strangers. Research shows there are sex differences in forgiveness. On average, women tend to be more forgiving than men. One reason may be that evolution favored behaviors in women that promoted relationship maintenance and social bonding. Those are key traits for caregiving and group harmony. And men, by contrast, may be more inclined to retaliate, at least in certain situations, those involving competition or threats to status, because for men, asserting dominance offered a survival edge. Culture also plays a role. In collectivist cultures like East Asia or Latin America, forgiveness is often emphasized as a way to maintain group harmony. But in more individualistic cultures like the US or parts of Western Europe, the focus may be more on personal justice or autonomy where forgiveness is more likely to hinge on apologies or restitution. We can also talk about intergroup forgiveness, which, like personal forgiveness, has variables which make it more likely. The three that are cited in the Macaulay article and supported by research are: one, collective apologies. That is, expressions of remorse by group representatives can signal a willingness to reconcile. Secondly, if the two groups have shared values and goals, common interests and objectives make forgiveness easier. And lastly, perceived interdependence. If the two groups recognize that in some way they are mutually reliant, it motivates groups to forgive past transgressions to achieve collective benefits. And lastly, evolutionary psychology can help us understand something very much more personal: self-forgiveness. And just as forgiving others restores group ties, forgiving ourselves is the way we manage guilt and shame. So we can repair that kind of damage and move forward. And again, it's a balance. Too little guilt, and you risk repeating harmful behavior, which will incur social costs. Too much guilt, and you get stuck in unproductive self-punishment that reduces your fitness. So let me kick the discussion off with a question. While forgiveness can repair relationships and promote cooperation, it can also have unintended consequences, like enabling future harmful behavior and leaving yourself open to being hurt again. In some cases, forgiving too quickly can erode trust or encourage repeat offenses. So, how do you know when forgiveness is the right choice and when it might be a mistake? What factors in a person or situation help you decide whether to forgive or retaliate? And I'll toss it open with that question. Hank, Hank, you're muted. At least I don't hear you. I think you are muted.
Yeah, lower left-hand corner, Hank.
I see a line through your little mic icon there. Does somebody else want to go while Hank figures out his audio? No?
Well, yeah,
Yeah,
I
Diane.
just sort of repeat one of the things you pointed out, which is that uh, in close and long-term relationships, generally speaking, having reconciliation is better than totally disrupting the relationship. And for relationships that are not so close or are anyway temporary or are otherwise dispensable, it may be easier to get revenge or at least not to reconcile. Having said all that, I think we might benefit from saying, what's the difference between forgiveness and reconciliation?
Hmm. Yeah, or forgiveness. Sometimes clinically, and I'm sure Hank will resonate with this, sometimes there's a distinction made between forgiveness and acceptance, not being quite the same. And Diane, you actually made me think that there's really three choices you have. There's one choice is to forgive, a second choice is to retaliate, and a third choice is to do neither.
Right.
It's sort of
Just get out of the relationship.
yes, but yeah.
That can be seen as a punishment.
Yes, sometimes that's a retaliation. Yeah. Hank, are you finally unmuted?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, it took a while. Just one thing is a piece of information. You said the three intergroup uh, forgiveness. I missed the middle one. It's a collective apologies, perceived independence. And what was
Shared
the middle?
shared values and goals.
Okay. Yeah, so my comment is it's just an observation. Did anybody look at the forgiveness test that they developed? Yeah, when you look on the stuff that you sent, Steve, one of them, when I read through it, it says go to our website and
Oh,
take the forgiveness test. So it's worth taking. It's a real simplistic thing. It's
uh-huh.
a kind of a survey thing. And So my question is, if you look at your own orientation to forgiveness or revenge, and then the other that I just thought of now is that what is your tribe's orientation towards forgiveness and revenge, and how does that? Really, we're talking about the collective that shaped me or you, and then I have my own personality and my own experiences. But you might think about it on a personal level. What were you taught, whether it's through religion, through their behavior, through a code of ethics?
Right. You make a really good point that I think personality is certainly a variable. And we all can think about people we know that we might tend to say they're a very forgiving person, or they're not a very forgiving person. That's certainly been in the news lately. Forgiveness has been in short supply in our culture lately, I think. But yeah, certainly personality variables play a role. Alan.
So that made me think. So my wife is a ESL teacher and sort of a culture nerd that she teaches adults, and she draws a distinction between cultures that allow conflict and have repair strategies, uh, and cultures such as Japan that don't have a lot of repair strategies, so that conflict is downplayed. And I think that might, when we're talking about culture, that would be a factor.
That's a very interesting. Yeah, cultures with repair strategies versus cultures that don't have that. Interesting. Yeah. Andy.
Um, that reference to Japan, I think, is fascinating. A friend of mine who lives in Japan says the Japanese are extremely careful not to tread on each other's toes. The ethic of I don't know, being a good neighbor, a good citizen is so strong, and that might lead to fewer transgressions that need forgiveness for. So their forgiveness muscles might be atrophied in part because they're a very regimented society that does a lot to avoid transgressions in the first place.
It also makes me think about the variable of population density as it might be related to proclivity to forgiveness versus revenge. I mean, I tend to think of Japan being very, having a lot of people per square mile that may have contributed to this. On the other hand, I suppose an argument could be made that if the population is quite dense, it could lead to people being a little prickly and more likely to retaliate. I'm not sure what the research shows on that.
Well,
I
and
think, yeah, go ahead.
just tack on one last thought. Of course, I think we've also talked about the difference between honor cultures
Yes.
and of course, the ability to inflict revenge on transgressors is big in honor cultures. It
Hmm.
would be true of Japan, the Scottish Highlands, the American
Hmm.
South.
Yeah.
Um, and yeah, I'll stop there.
Forgive me if I'm going out of order, but I think it's Rob, Ken, and then Diane.
You're
Rob.
muted, Rob.
There you
Trying
go.
to unmute and it won't. Everything's changed. Uh, I'm just thinking that if I remember Christopher Bohm accurately, okay, everything froze.
We can hear you okay. Yeah.
Okay. If I remember Christopher Bohm in Hierarchy in the Forest correctly, there's really a hierarchy of sanctions that you can take against a bad actor,
Hmm.
at least in a small group. So it starts out with shunning or kidding, and gradually increases in force as the response comes back. So the final sanction is you kill them, and in some instances that's the only option left.
Hmm.
So I think that you don't just jump from one to the other. It's either forgiveness um, or serious sanction.
Rob,
And
do you think forgiveness has gradations that
yeah,
way as well?
oh
Well,
yeah. How
what
many
might
times have people said, "I'll forgive, but I'll never forget"?
Hmm.
well, I can clearly see how if you're going to retaliate, it could start low and build to the ultimate retaliation. I'm struggling a little bit though to think about what that a ladder of forgiveness would look like.
Well, it might involve just gradually extending trust again, like
Yeah.
a little bit of trust and then a little bit more, a little bit more.
Okay, it's more maybe attitudinal than behavioral, which is why I'm having difficulty. With the retaliation ladder, it's different behaviors you're doing. With the forgiveness ladder, it seems like it's more attitudinal, maybe somehow. But yeah, uh,
No, there's behavior. If the behavior changes and the bad actor starts straightening out and behaving more appropriately, the sanction is loosened.
yeah,
They welcome back into the community. It doesn't have to be a forgiveness thing. You just sort of let them know that it's okay to come back.
okay. So no longer retaliating is maybe the lowest rung on the forgiveness ladder, I
Yeah.
suppose. Um, I think we have Ken, Diane, Hank, and then Chris.
Okay, briefly, just to provide a bit of a framework for what Andy and Rob said. I think so much of this is imposed or controlled by social control. We all evolved in this tribal paradigm, and tribes that were cohesive beat tribes that weren't. Tribes that were cohesive had two things going for them. They had altruism, evolved altruism, and then cohesion, and then social control. And the social control is provided by religion and government. And social control controls so much of that. The whole purpose of the whole idea is the group has to cooperate, and so the group enforces a certain amount of forgiveness. I mean, look at Christianity, where you're told to forgive everyone, and then it's the people on high who determine the one person who can't be forgiven, and then he gets handed over to the church authorities and taken care of.
Mhm.
So much of it is controlled by that. Um,
Of course, the
and
Catholic Church, the Catholic Church had a built-in ritual for forgiveness called confession,
Mhm.
right?
for personal forgiveness, forgiveness of oneself.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, and that of course, and then of course that the guilt is again part of the social control, which is to get a person to behave in a certain fashion. But if he's too guilty, then his behavior deteriorates, etc.
Mhm.
So we have confession, etc. But on a different subject, it's interesting. There's a difference between forgiveness, emotional forgiveness, and again, permission or acceptance of the behavior. And that's especially introduced in Buddhism and mindfulness, where the concept of you forgive, but it's recognition that we're all suffering, but that you still are permitted effect. The term used is effective action. You are still required, not only permitted, but required to engage in effective action. So you forgive the person, and then you put a handcuff on him and you take him to jail because he committed a crime. So that's a sort of an interesting point that,
Just another comment about religion. It made me realize that within Christianity, of course, and this may be an Old Testament, New Testament division, but there are admonitions to both retaliate and forgive. An eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth is certainly retaliatory, and that's from the Bible. But so, of course, Jesus is teaching to turn the other cheek, are to well, not only forgive, but be willing to accept future exploitation, I suppose. And
yeah,
anyway,
that's very much an Old Testament, New Testament thing,
yeah, yeah.
I think.
Um, Diane and then Hank and then Chris.
Yeah, I've been thinking that maybe we can look at it in terms of the relative positions of the violator and the person who's reacting. In a relatively equal situation, it seems like, okay, you have some kind of misbehavior and you can then get revenge. On the other hand, if there's an authority involved, it's not revenge, it's punishment. Um, and those are kind of different things.
Right.
Punishment may or may not fit the crime, I suppose, just like revenge may or may not fit the offense, whatever it was. But it seems to me that authority or non-authority is an important aspect of this, and it should affect what happens in terms of reconciliation.
It also strikes me that it made me think of Pinker's book, Better Angels, in which as nation states and as governments began, there was no, you no longer had a need to personally retaliate. And that a governmental entity would punish the transgressor. And we don't talk about a government as retaliating. We talk about it as punishment. Whereas if the person who was hurt does the quote unquote punishing, then we call that retaliation.
But governments can retaliate against one another.
That's
The,
true.
the
China
word
just
they use is
put in
justice.
retaliatory
Justice.
tariffs, for
Yeah,
example.
yeah, that's happened a few times in history, I think. Hank and Chris.
Yeah. Uh, in the discussion, I came to try to sort out these two concepts of looking at forgiveness. And I don't have any studied names for this, but I want to think of two types of forgiveness. One is performative. Is that a word people use? It's a kind of
Sure.
in psychoanalytic thinking, it's kind of a false self. You do, see, how did I write it down? You
Mhm.
behave in ways that the group requires you, but you really don't. But you don't really feel it. You don't really live it. It's performative, and then you've got how do you integrate forgiveness and it's solid and it's just not just the what Jesus talked about, and then like you said, Steve, you're going to be exploited. So what? But if you have a solid sense based on your culture and your own personality about really believing that that really is true and that you'll die for that, you'll risk your comfort zone, um, and you don't care about the future exploitation because that's your deep thing. And I wonder if people have thought about it because a lot of what goes on is what I've seen, at least with individuals and small groups, is performative. I can't go back to our ancestors and say, I got to do what they say or else they're going to kill me or kick me out. But I'll go along. I'll fawn. I'll perform it. So
Well, the performative concept made me think of a decision that all parents have to make, and sometimes husbands and wives don't agree. And it's when, let's say, one sibling has hurt another sibling. And is it good
yeah.
parenting or not to tell your child, tell your brother you're sorry, even though you know it's going to be performative? I don't know.
Well,
Maybe a child psychologist says that maybe there's research on that. I don't
well, we
know.
could we could again study the how the group forces permitted to be integrated deeply rather than performative. And I don't
Mhm.
have kids, so but I do that with people anyways. Yeah,
Chris
but
has Chris has been
yeah,
Chris has been patiently waiting for a long time.
yeah.
So go ahead.
Yeah, no, I just had a few comments about this forgiveness ladder idea. And I'm sorry I had to go take a call, but I did want to point out that I think one reason women might forgive more is because they lack the power to do other things. Um, that men that's more available to men, whether it's physical power or organizational power or relationship power or money. Like if you're dependent on someone, you might have to forgive them because that's all you got. Um, but in terms of a forgiveness ladder, you think of people that have offended you, for example, and it seems to me there's a ladder of, okay, well, can I be in the same space with this person? Can I have a formal conversation with this person in the company of other people? There's kind of a ladder of how are you willing to interact with someone who has wronged you, and that can be sort of a slow process, but there are a lot of steps that you can imagine in that. And then there's, of course, the possibility of mediation. But I think one rather common, something that is much more common now is the whole idea of restorative justice, which is designed, and I've been involved in a circle of people engaged in restorative justice that had to do with something that happened with an organization I'm involved in. And it was very interesting, and because the whole idea was that you bring people together and the people who were wronged talk to the people who, so they're brought into this process because there's a threat of legal action.
Both
And if the
parties have to be
restorative,
willing.
yeah, so
Both
they
parties
have
have
to,
to be willing. Yeah.
right. Well, this is a situation where some youth did something, and
Mhm.
they and their parents had to show up, as well as us as representative
Mhm.
of the organization that was damaged.
Okay.
And so the kids were there, the parents were there, we were there, and we could talk about how this damage affected us as individuals, how it felt to experience this, and so these kids had to listen to this. And then and then it was mediated, and there was a discussion about, well, okay, what now what? And it was, I, I thought it was very effective because I think, this vandalism that had occurred, they they seemed to understand what that impact was. Um, and I think restorative justice is increasingly being used, and was a way for uh, us to see how that these kids were reacting,
Yeah.
that they did seem genuinely sorry, and then there was a decision about what they needed to do in the way of
If,
like community service or something. So
if you happen to watch the video that I put as a resource, which was a talk by Thomas Macaulay, who is the lead author of the paper I posted, the video was a talk he actually gave at a law school. And the end of the talk, he fielded questions on restorative justice, and what he cited, he said it was one of the largest effect sizes he's ever seen in social science research, of the power of restorative justice. But before we go to the other hands, I wanted Chris to follow up with your comment about some gender differences. So let's think for a moment about all female friendship group versus an all male friendship group. Does forgiveness come easier to one group than another? There's a bit of a stereotype, at least in thinking about raising two sons and one daughter, that boys would throw a punch and it would be over. Whereas girls would harbor grudges and resentments, and it would linger for quite a long time. Now that's kind of stereotypical, but does anybody think that forgiveness operates differently between men as a same-sex group than between a group of women?
I have no idea. I went to an all girls school for junior high and high school, and um, I don't remember grudges
Okay,
being held, but I also was not part of the in crowd, so I might not have known about them.
okay,
Can I jump in and say
yeah, yeah,
whether it's within the same sex or between sexes may make more difference?
mm-hmm,
Uh,
mm-hmm.
that is, if women do more forgiving, it's probably forgiving of men.
Remember the book and the movie that the tagline was "Love means never having to say you're sorry." I've That's often amused me because it seems to me that love means always having to say you're
Always say,
Exactly.
No, I really don't know that throwing a punch. I mean, maybe it's more that women think. I do think women think more about relationships
hmm
than men do.
hmm Okay.
And so I think that may be the difference. And so maybe the guy throws a punch and then he doesn't think about it. That doesn't mean he's forgiven anybody.
Okay.
But it also might mean that I don't know. I mean, I'm not sure. I'm not sure that part. I don't know because I haven't been in an all men's group.
Yeah,
Well, I want
it
to.
may be that the type of retaliation is different. That young boys might tend to retaliate physically, and then feel things are done, whereas girls might be more likely to retaliate with social exclusion, and things, different types of weapons being used, so to speak.
Well,
But
Steve.
let me
Uh,
go to Andy because he's had his
uh,
hand up, and then I think Hank and Ken.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. Yeah, I wanted to reconnect this
Forgiveness.
to your question about um, performative. Well, I guess Hank raised the question of sort of performative forgiveness versus genuine or heartfelt. Put
Yeah.
yourself in the shoes of somebody who serves on a parole board, right? So a former offender comes up and you have to think about whether they deserve release. One of the big questions, of course, is their repentance genuine?
Hmm.
You get any sense that the repentance is merely performative, then you're liable to keep them locked up. But there's something about genuine contrition that signals people that you might be a reasonable um, partner for mutual trust, a mutual trusting relationship again. Um, Back to the question of whether it makes sense to have your children say they're sorry. I think it does, even if it's merely performative. Practicing performative apology can actually help to instill an awareness of when apology is appropriate. And I think you can actually learn to develop the right feelings by simply being forced to go through the performative ritual. I think gratitude can also be ritualized in ways that, so for example, but I'll stop there.
Has anybody seen the show Severance? Well, just bear with me for 1 second because when someone transgresses in this office culture, this is what the punishment is. They're taken into a room in which they're connected up to various like EKGs or like a lie detector type of system, and they are made to read an apology for their transgression, and they are not let out of the room until the machine says they believe the apology.
Hmm.
And, I think one character reads it, 1,300 times. But it's quite interesting is that if your only way out was to convince yourself that you actually believe the words you were saying, there would be an incentive to actually believe them. It's quite an interesting little thing in that show. Um, Ken and then Hank, I think.
Actually, I think it was Hank and then me.
Okay, Hank, go ahead.
Yeah. Um, let's see. I want to think about forgiveness uh, and the factors about the size of group, our ancestor group and our large groups, and the what should we call it? The evolutionary mismatch
Mm,
about the role of forgiveness. Now,
mhm,
if the group was 150 people, you kind of get to know everybody. I work with a young fellow who grew up in a Kurdish town in Turkey, and there were like 1,000 people. He knew everybody. Everybody knew everybody, and he talks about who to trust, who not to trust. You find out for yourself as a kid. You listen to your parents. So it's 1,000 people. It's not 150. But here, um, let's say, do I have to forgive a relative who's harmed me if I don't really need them for anything else except their blood? Okay, so I think so. What did I learn from my family? What did I learn from my religion? What did I learn from my culture? Do I participate with a minimum of trust? I don't have to forgive that person. I could just hold on to the connection or get rid of it. But in terms of degrees of separation, we got so many degrees of separation. How heartfelt, thank you, Andy, for that term, can it really be when you have so many degrees of separation and so many people and conflicting norms coming from different tribes and different groups? So
Hmm.
I think we have to, is forgiveness really, the other thing is forgiveness in the type of group. If you're in a criminal group, yeah, if you want to be part of that group, they'll forgive you if you made a mistake and didn't rob the right bank or something. But that's for the purpose of doing what the group's goal is, what the group's mission is. So I think it's quite complex rather than looking at forgiveness as just a generalization. But
Well,
how does
your
it actually?
observation about mismatch is what is a really good one, Hank, I think, in terms of forgiveness operating differently in small groups where you had repeated interactions with those
Mhm.
folks the rest of your lives and depended on them. That's a very different situation than how forgiveness operates in our modern world, where, somebody cuts me off on the highway. I don't even know who it is. Do I forgive them or be retaliatory and zoom in front of them and cut them off? There's a modern decision point. Ken and Diane.
Okay, a few points. I'm going to have to talk fast. First of all, in terms of difference between men and women for forgiveness, evolutionary science has taught us something specifically in regard to men and women's forgiveness of each other's straying from
Yes.
a marital relationship. And
Yes.
if, the man is very intolerant because
Uh-huh.
a woman only has to sleep with one person to have
Mhm.
genetics, whereas a woman is more concerned about the resource. Very briefly, there's a funny little story about this. George Burns was really devoted to Gracie Allen, but
Mhm.
once he slipped and had an affair, and he felt so guilty that he brought home a large uh, centerpiece for the table, a beautiful thing, just very expensive. And Gracie was thrilled to receive it. And she kind of found out later what was going on. And so someone was interviewing her later, and her forgiveness was obvious when somewhat later someone interviewed her, and she said, "Gee, I wish George would have another affair. I need a new centerpiece." Um, okay, on a more serious topic, um, just very briefly, Chris, you talked about, some people not being able to engage in revenge because they just can't afford to. That's especially true in abusive relationships. Someone is either financially or more often emotionally dependent, and so they're unable to take well, in Buddhists, we would call it effective action. The forgiveness would be there, but we would take effective action, either get out or report it or whatever, and they're unable to do that. And the last point. Okay, I wanted to say something about the old saw that revenge is a dish that is best served cold. And I wonder if that refers to this work by Daniel Kahneman in Thinking Fast and Slow, if in fact the system one, which is fast thinking, is most likely to engage in a form of revenge, which will be either disapproved by others or be either insufficient or more likely the opposite, be much greater than what is absolutely needed. So it would seem to me that that old saw has something to do with System One and System Two thinking. If anybody's familiar with Daniel Kahneman's work.
Yes, and if you think about that in terms of Richard Wrangham's book about the execution hypothesis, I think the title of the book was The Goodness Paradox. We did a session on that
How
a
do you
while
spell his name, Raymond?
Wrangham. At any rate, he talks about the difference between reactive and proactive aggression. Reactive aggression is hot and immediate, and proactive aggression is kind of cold and calculated and
Mhm.
planned and often coalitional. So that would be another way to talk about the difference between, cold versus hot retaliation, I guess. Diane and then Alan.
Yeah, I just wanted to suggest that we think about it a little bit in terms of culture and what kinds of mechanisms culture gives us for reconciliation or punishment or revenge. In other words, what's an appropriate response to a given offense can be very much culturally defined, and it may also be ritualized. So like Steve was asking, should you make your children apologize? Well, apology is a ritual, basically. And it's to establish a kind of reciprocity. I suppose it's a kind of restorative uh, action. I'm not sure Chris would agree with that because she had much more concrete thing. But uh, what makes it restorative is that, in a sense, you subordinate yourself to the other. That is, you give up a bit of your uh, status
Yeah.
to get forgiveness. And
I
then
think,
if that was enough, then you're forgiven, and then you can reconcile and go on. If it's not enough, then there has to be some kind of further punishment or degradation or something to even it out. It's, what this all revolves around, it seems to me, is the idea of reciprocity.
mhm.
It's tit for tat.
And you really do make me think about the fact that we've all probably had an experience where we've apologized without really meaning it
Of course.
in order to just
What
restore
you do is
peace.
you accept that humiliating position.
Hmm. And
Hmm.
the person that you're apologizing to sometimes says, I won't accept your apology because I don't think you mean it. And sometimes, even though they know you don't really mean it, they will accept it
Yes,
because, yes,
because they know they don't have any further leverage over you,
yeah,
probably.
yeah, interesting.
If you can be cynical about it.
Yeah, interesting. I think I've lost track of whose hands went up first. Do you
Alan,
guys know? Alan and then Andy and Chris?
Okay, let
Chris and
me
then
actually unmute before I start, as opposed to what I usually do. The So drawing out the cultural thing more, and responding to Ken's point on marital fidelity, I mean, I basically agree, but both marital and fidelity are cultural terms. And there are cultures in which that definition of marital fidelity was essentially meaningless. Uh, so, um, ancient Greece and ancient Crete were quite different, would have quite different definitions of it. And certainly, if you go out to anthropology, there's all sorts of different sexual mores around exclusiveness or non exclusiveness. So I think we have to be a little careful and continually remember we're generalizing from within, a couple thousand years or more of patriarchal society.
It
Uh,
also makes me think of Buss's well-known research on sex differences and reactions to emotional infidelity versus sexual infidelity,
uh-huh.
in which
Yeah,
men would be much more reactive to a partner's sexual infidelity, and the vice versa. Women would be more reactive to
yeah,
a partner's emotional infidelity, even if there wasn't sexual. At least that's what Buss's research found, 20 or
right.
20 or 30 years ago. That's old research at this point. But
Yeah,
yeah.
and just a couple other tag things. I don't know exactly where they go, but there's the old "living well is the best revenge" saw,
Hmm.
which sort of to me ties into. There's also a power gradient where I can say, "You're so insignificant, I forgive you because you
Mm-hmm.
can't affect me one way or another."
Right.
Uh, uh, so if we're talking about power and forgiveness, that's certainly an angle we haven't touched on.
Interesting. Yeah. Um, Andy and then Chris.
I think I've had more turns than Chris, so I'm going to let her go first.
Okay.
I just have a short comment to make, which is I heard a forensic psychologist speak once. And the thing that really stuck with me from that was that he said, anyone can be a murderer. What murderers have in common is not their background, but that they've been humiliated.
Hmm.
Hmm.
So that's all I wanted to add, because I thought that was so interesting, and I've always remembered it because the power it's a power of humiliation that can drive behavior that might not otherwise occur. At least that's what this forensic psychologist. So.
Interesting.
That
It sounds
suggests,
like a bit of an overgeneralization, but with perhaps some grains of truth.
Yeah, I'm sure it was an overgeneralization because plenty of people are humiliated and it would never occur to them to murder somebody. But what he's saying is that what all murderers have in common, what murderers tend to have in common is that
Yeah.
they've been humiliated.
And people murder for financial gain who haven't been humiliated. So there are other motivations, of course, but
That's true.
that's probably not an uncommon one, I would imagine, particularly for men in terms of, they're very sensitive to where they are in the status hierarchy. So Hank and then Marcia.
oh, hey, I'm
Oh,
sorry.
Andy.
Oh, I'm sorry. Andy and then Hank and then Marcia.
Diane mentioned tit for tat before, and that, of course, is a name for a behavioral strategy that involves repaying people in kind for what they do to you. It's also the name of a very simple computer program that won a famous tournament that was testing game theorists' ability to design a behavioral strategy that would result in long-term cooperation. So if you have these little software programs face off against each other in what's called an iterated prisoner's dilemma, where you have a choice between cooperating and being more vulnerable or defecting and being more aggressive and transgressive. And it turns out that the simplest program submitted into the first tournament was called tit for tat. And it was very simple. It was cooperate in round one and then do whatever the other guy did in the previous round for all subsequent rounds. And you'll notice a couple things about this program. Is number one is it starts off friendly. So its initial programming, there's a very simple mathematical or programming correlate of friendliness, which is cooperate first. And then, of course, the vengefulness is encoded in this rule, do unto them what they did unto you last time, whether friendly or not. And notice also that tit for tat does not contain any provisions it does contain some elements of forgiveness, because if you defect against tit for tat and then go back to cooperating, it will eventually come around and start cooperating with you again. So it turns out that some of the simplest mathematical experiments that try to shed light on the dynamics on the evolution of cooperation underscore the importance of vengefulness and forgiveness for the development and maintenance of mutually beneficial cooperative relationships.
Marcia? You need to unmute.
I came in late and I didn't know whether you all had discussed how forgiveness impacts the person who might be forgiving, who's forgiving. How, when you make a decision whether you're going to forgive or you're not going to forgive, the differential impact on the internal life of that individual. Did you all discuss that?
No, say more about what you're thinking there, Marcia.
Well, I had a stand-up comic for a dad, so he tended to put things in terse statements. But one of his statements was, if you don't forgive people, you're giving them free rent in your heart.
That's lovely.
Okay, so that's what I was raised with. And so I was urged under all circumstances for my own benefit, I should be as forgiving as possible in every situation. And an interesting corollary of that late in life, which is where I am, is in my whole meditation process. I find out the minute I click on to self-forgiveness as a mantra, everything just opens up in this incredible, predictable, not many things in my meditation are predictable. It would be wonderful if it were, but it's not, except and this has just been a recent discovery. if I focus on forgiveness, it all just goes into this marvelous meditative, restorative, whatever we're doing all this meditation for. So those were my two comments, and I just wondered if you would discuss those dimensions.
Let me just say one thing back to you. I'm curious how you would react to this. I think all of us probably have had the experience you're describing of how forgiving involves letting go and how that can be very
Hmm.
restorative to the
Mhm.
person. But there's also the possibility that in forgiving you open yourself up to future uh, exploitation by the person. Are there times when, despite what you're saying, and I agree with it, despite the restorative internal process, where forgiving can be against your self-interest because you're communicating to the other person that you can be taken advantage of again?
I would say that the major fundamental experiences of forgiving people who actually have offered trauma in my life, a time period went by, I was out of their authority or their
Mhm.
presence. So forgiving did not hold any risk for me whatsoever.
Okay.
Mhm.
So I'd have to qualify. I'm not sure. And when the things were happening, I was very young, and believe me, it was not, how should we say, in the response versus reaction mode.
Mhm.
But that would be my comment.
Right.
Is
So
get out of the, get away
yeah,
from them
if
and
the
then forgive them.
if you're still embedded in the relationship, there
Right,
might there might be some interpersonal risks to forgiving,
Mhm.
despite the psychological or spiritual benefit it might have.
right.
So that's,
I,
yeah.
I can I can I can understand that, and my comments are based on um, doing the most on forgiveness of others is after I've removed myself from their authority.
Yeah. Okay. Hank and then Rob and then Ken.
Yeah. I'll make this brief, but I'd like us to think of this as another topic and think of forgiveness as one collective strategy to do harm reduction. In other words, if our first wired response to being hurt or somehow perceiving being hurt is revenge, I'm not sure forgiveness is the first mode of harm reduction. So I'm not sure what they would be. I just get only gave it some thought as we're talking now. It'll be interesting to see like what are the buildups in different groups over time for the ancients as well as now as to one harm reduction is to put people in jail. I don't know if it works, but I'm wondering if we should consider it and if somebody wants to do that. Because I think it would flush out more the complexities of the human condition.
Well, you're going back to our earlier discussion about whether there's a sort of a ladder of forgiveness and what those would be, and also our earlier comments about the distinction between punishment and forgiveness.
Right.
So that let's
Right.
say let's say I'm a crime victim, the criminal justice system might put the person who transgressed against me in jail. They might punish that person.
Hmm.
But that's separate from whether or not I forgive the person.
Right. But I'd rather think of it as to work with the baseline of revenge and to what strategies have the ancients used and do we use or different tribes use to soften the blow of revenge.
Hmm.
I want to leave forgiveness out of it because that could be one. There must be other strategies that I've not looked into, but if I have time to think about it, I can come up with it. So it's
Okay.
it's not about forgiveness. It's about reducing the long term effect of the reactive revenge that we're wired to do.
Okay. So you're kind of saying, Hank, if I hear you correctly, are there other ways to not retaliate that don't involve forgiveness? I,
Right.
I suppose you could just choose not to retaliate, even if you don't forgive. I guess you don't have to forgive to not retaliate, right?
If you
I mean,
can.
Yeah, I mean, whether or not I forgive is sort of a attitudinal or emotional state. Revenge is to me more behavioral. I'm going to do something back to you. But Rob and Ken.
I'm going to follow on Hank a little bit. We're not mentioning the absolutely delicious and ripe pleasure of vengeance, which in literature and in film and you look at the Oresteia or in Shakespeare, the pleasure of revenge is really sweet. And there's a section in Game of Thrones where a really awful character is at the end eaten by his own dogs. And that felt really satisfying.
Note to
I
self,
grant you,
don't piss Rob off.
So I don't think we should forget the attraction
Yep.
uh, of getting even.
You're right. In literature and film and theater, the revenge is certainly a more of a dominant motif that you see
Mm.
How
than
many plays about forgiveness are there?
forgiveness, for sure. Yeah. And I suppose there's vicarious satisfaction we in the audience take when somebody is transgressed against in a movie or a story, and they get the offender gets their comeuppance in some way.
I don't want to say I spend a lot of time fantasizing about hanging Trump upside down from a lamppost, but thinking about Mussolini from time to time is
Well,
pleasurable.
there is. I know Ken has his hand up, but there is something that in we could talk about in our remaining time. We're actually at the hour, and people are free to depart. But
Can I just respond to this?
yes, go ahead, and then I'll.
And that,
Yeah, go ahead.
and that's just that, one of the studies that was quoted, one of the things I read that was in the preparation, one of the articles said that it would seem that revenge would provide the most satisfaction. But they've done long-term psychological studies, and people who forgive and don't take revenge actually
Mhm.
end up more peaceful than those who have taken revenge.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
it certainly has its place in
It's
public.
it's not
Well,
it's not always good.
no. But Ken, there's
Uh,
a caveat in their research. Some of the researchers talk about, we have not done, these are all experiments in social psychology, and therefore they've not done it in real life. So these findings are pretty limited about, let's say, the satisfaction of revenge. That's just little studies with game theory and all that. So I think there's more to think about. Freud talked about sadism. It's been going on for a long time, and the satisfaction of harming others. That's going on in our public domain. So I think these studies are limited based on the researcher's own observations.
We
If there's real harm, yeah.
we've spent most of our time talking, I think, about forgiveness and revenge and sort of interpersonal relationships as opposed to on a societal scale. And I'm just wondering, it does have implications for the topic of reparations. It has implications for, I think, of the South African Truth and Reconciliation commissions, which really involved acts of contrition and forgiveness on a societal scale. And I also think about a contemporary political scene in our country, in America, and to what degree are we going to need to, on a societal level, embrace forgiveness to somehow heal the divisions that currently exist. That's a whole mess I've just tossed out there, but just shift for a few minutes and talk about revenge and forgiveness on a societal scale rather than in our individual lives.
Somebody mentioned Mussolini, and I was just curious, has anybody studied Italy and how they put themselves together after World War II? Because they also had an incredible split between pro-Mussolini and anti-Mussolini. And then after it was all over, then they had to go back living in the boot together. Have
Mhm.
there been studies on that?
Not that I'm aware of, but there.
I think we
Or
should.
or more contemporary Rwanda,
Yeah,
Right.
right?
yeah, yeah. You're right, Alan. Yes. Hmm. But any thoughts on
Yeah.
societal issues here? Yeah.
Well, I can come up with the term collective forgiveness as well as collective retaliation to
Hmm.
give us like a kind of a label to think about. And is that there's a term that in the psychoanalytic world it's called the social unconscious, which suggests that collective activity kind of gets stored in out of awareness in our in neural pathways. So, is there such a thing as uh, the collective unconscious of forgiveness, and what are the what context can you get that collective unconscious to come to to move to a position where it can have some impact within the culture, and then that's within the group, let's say the United States, or the out groups, other cultures. So I'd like to consider that the collective forgiveness.
And we can talk about collective forgiveness within a nation and between nations. And if we stick with between nations for a moment, have there been situations where a nation has been transgressed against and has responded with forgiveness rather than retaliation? None are springing to mind.
Only the Amish.
Nations seem to always retaliate for fear that if they don't, they'll be exploited again. Like,
Right.
are there examples of nation states that have had something done to them where they have not retaliated?
I could only speak to the little bit of literature on the Amish, but they're not a nation state. They seem
Yes,
to. Okay.
yes,
Other
yeah,
than that, no.
Well,
yeah,
I think the difference in the behavior of the victors after World War One and World War Two to Germany, you can't say that was forgiveness, but you can say that somebody learned something really powerful about not using revenge to create another, to form a relationship with another nation.
and to and to
Because
and to piggyback on something someone said earlier, it's people say that one of the seeds of World War II was that Germany felt humiliated
Mm-hmm.
absolutely,
forever.
absolutely.
Hmm.
In
Yeah,
Japan also, Japan in fact adopted Western Moors and was attracted even more so than
right.
even
But
more
I'm
so than
talking
Yeah.
Germany.
less about after the conflict has happened, um, being generous and forgiving to the defeated party. I'm talking more about when a nation state has been attacked or been something has been done to them. I mean, we can just think about
So
the tariffs that are
so
going on.
It
Are
it's
there any nations that have said,
yeah,
"Well, we forgive you. We won't put
there's
I
retaliation"?
think so. I think Vietnam and the United States at the moment would be an example of that.
Okay.
yeah, that took a while, but there's several instances of uh, former territories or colonies or whatever rebelling at some cost to the invader and
Hmm.
succeeding, and then fairly quick reconciliation. The US versus England would be one example of that, or India versus England.
I'm asking something different. I'm not asking about reconciliation after the retaliation. I'm trying to think about in international relations, are there been times when nations don't retaliate against another nation that has hurt them in some way?
I'm
Uh,
I'm I'm my muted. I'm going with Vietnam. I mean, so I'm in the backpacking biz or was,
Uh-huh.
and Osprey, which is a huge backpacking business, has a factory in Vietnam, and a number of vets actually returned to Vietnam and started businesses. And the government, both the government and the people seemed incredibly forgiving of a culture that had attempted to, some voices, what was the phrase, bomb them back into the Stone Age.
Yeah, again, that's forgiveness
After the fact.
after the fact.
You mean
Yeah.
during it, like keep bombing me, no problem? Is that the
Well,
type of thing you're looking for? I don't understand.
I guess I'm
Well,
wondering. Yeah, go
Steve,
ahead.
the thing that comes to me whenever a leader has done that, that has actually just strengthened the aggression of the person that, I mean, Chamberlain in Germany, he didn't react with revenge or whatever. And that's called accommodation.
Right.
When you're in a tense situation like that.
So forgiveness in international relations is rare.
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
Intergroup relations doesn't even have to be nation.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
I think it's an interesting topic to kind of try to understand that in one of our meetings as to that level of international intergroup relations. And the hypothesis is that it's rare that there's forgiveness or something of that nature. Because we don't know why. The only thing we know is the mismatch, the evolutionary mismatch. They were just too big.
Yeah.
And there's just one more thing, and there's too many perceived scarce resources
Mm-hmm.
on an international level.
I don't think it's the too bigness. I think it is the fact that they're two different in groups.
Just that.
You can be small and still not be able to. I mean, there's a question to be asked. Is there a morality of intergroup relations?
But isn't this just balancing a cooperative relationship versus a competitive one?
Mm-hmm.
Well, when you have a cooperative relationship, haven't you basically said, okay, we are two parts of a larger whole?
Let me make one last comment about this and then suggest something for next month that Andy had actually suggested. I think this whole topic pertains to reparations. And one of the ways in which it pertains to reparations is that we tend to think about reparations as having to be monetary. And reparations can involve apologies without monetary compensation. And I think the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commissions are the exemplar of that. The exemplar of that. There was
Rwanda also.
no monetary process in that, but it was very healing for the nation. And I don't think America is anywhere near ready at this particular cultural and political moment to do anything about reparations. But if and when the topic comes up, I think Americans get stuck in thinking that it has to mean writing checks, and there are other ways to think about reparations besides monetary. We're nearing the end of our time, and Andy, if you're still there, you want to toss out your topic that you suggested maybe our May session. Are you still there, Andy?
I think he said goodbye.
Well, he said goodbye, but he didn't
Oh,
sign off. Well,
Oh,
he had suggested that maybe a topic that would be interesting to do next month or another month if we don't do it next month is play, the evolutionary psychology and significance of play.
ah,
Would that be interesting to folks? It's quite a shift from revenge and retaliation.
we could use a buffer anyways. I don't need it, but it might be good for our
Crystal likes
morale
it.
to have a buffer. Yeah.
Okay, all right, that's good. Then I'll be happy to. Yeah, Andy suggested it, but he didn't want to facilitate it, so I can find some resources on that, and we could do that in May.
Can I suggest, Diane, you brought up, I think it's a great idea, is there a morality of intergroup relations?
right.
I don't know who's going to do it, but I think it's a great topic because it will keep us at the societal level.
Well,
Hard
it's
to say that,
suggested
though.
by the United Nations, but not many people pay attention.
Well, does it work? You know, there's a group. It's called the Israel-Palestinian Alliance. I don't know, but I've been following it. And they're attempting. They've been having discourse for about a year and a half about setting up a federation, Palestinian-Israeli Federation, that would be the morality for how these two countries operate together. They have good talks, they have good speakers, and they get you to participate and vote. So you walk in the middle of it. But that's the newest thing that I've been aware of, and it's interesting. It's a great topic to think about something. It's pretty frightening, but is there one? And is there a universal morality, or is it, of course, culture based, depending on each nation, what's their culture, and what's considered oh God, what's the word? What's considered the right thing to do?
Well,
You know,
that's
not
yeah.
everybody's a Buddhist, you know.
If there's any place where cycles of mutual retaliation have been unproductive, it's the East, Hank.
Yeah.
For
There
sure.
is an organization, Hank, called Pro-Social, which is
Yeah.
I think, isn't that their premise? Is that they're
Marcia, they have not reached the highest level of developing a federation that's going to influence different. It's a small trial
okay?
attempt, you know? And I don't
Well,
know. It's a great idea to apply those principles. We did that a few weeks ago. We were talking about, can we apply those principles on a societal level? And somebody, I don't know what Alan said, but I think Stephen, I think you said you didn't think so.
well, I struggled to figure it out. How do you
Yeah,
set
that's
it up? But I would
yeah.
only say that I can't think of anything that's more pro-social than forgiveness. So maybe we can end
Absolutely.
there. And
All
Sage,
right.
before we everyone signs off, Sage has his hand up.
I just dropped a link in the chat, and I'll make sure to email it and everything. But I made this landing page for us, which I think will help us just stay super clear and function independently of pro-social world or any other things like that. The main thing to know is that we will use a Google Meet link instead of Zoom, so we don't have to worry about the subscription and all of that. And um, that link is there's a big button right at the top, and it's you can scroll down at the bottom. There's a calendar which we can use. So you could just flag that landing page. We'll still post on Hilo, and you could that'll still be a zone for conversation and other things, but that landing page should make it super clear how to join, what's coming up next, and yeah. So just if there's one thing you do besides bookmark that, just swap out the Zoom link if you have your own calendar going or whatever with the new link, the new Google Meet link at the top.
Okay. All right. Thanks, Sage.
I
Thank you. And
didn't
who hosts that?
I didn't
Who
quite
hosts that
understand
session?
how we're going to access this.
Well, what Sage is
Send it?
we're in this process where Examine Lives used to be part of Pro Social World, but we're no longer part of Pro Social World.
Right.
And so we have to sort of migrate into a emancipated child status now. We have to live on our own. And Sage and I have been talking about how best to do that. And the Hilo platform, even the new version of it, I still don't find particularly user friendly. For example, it was not easy to find the Zoom link when you go to Examine Lives on Hilo. Uh,
Right.
it's not easy to find it, and I wonder if that's why we're getting just basically returnees for the most part, because new people may have trouble finding the link. I'm not sure, but Sage, I think, is developing a page which if we can get it to. There's 70 some people on the Examine Lives member list. If we can get this page that Sage just designed out to everybody, it'll be a place to begin. And I guess the Google thing is free compared to Zoom, so that also makes it more user friendly.
Yeah, just to
Absolutely.
answer your question, Diane, it's in the chat. The link is in the chat when you
Yeah.
said how to get. And
Ah,
my question, Sage, who hosts this little mini site?
I just set it up on my personal Gmail, and I put Steve on there too. I could put anybody who wants to be on there if you want to. I don't think there's much to change at this point because really it's just a calendar. So we can edit the events there. So if anything, that would be a better thing to add people to. Just but between Steve and I think we'll put the details on there. I think we should still use Hilo just because it's nice for to be able to talk and and that's there and that's a kind of. But this just you got that landing page link. I'll make sure to send it out to everybody. We'll put it out there a bunch of ways. Um, but this should be the kind of single source of truth, and we'll just maintain this. Um, yeah.
Okay. Sage and I are going to stay on and chat briefly about this, just the two of us, but everybody else can sign off. But
Okay.
we'll see you in May to talk about play.